Yeah, welcome also from my side. Now it's on me to give you the boring talk because we are talking about law. Thank you for the invitation. It's an amazing conference. Nice to be here. I try to shed some light on some of the points we've already touched in Alexander's introduction on the new idea the EU Commission came up with on a tariff rate quota for imports. The interesting aspect of this quota is it's another and a new trade defense instrument. I've prepared a slide here, trade defense instruments. We have so many in the EU, we can't even fit them all on one slide. We have anti-dumping, we have countervailing duties, we have CBAM. CBAM is always argued, by the way, by the EU Commission that it is by design and by law not a trade defense instrument. Yeah, that's the legal opinion or the opinion on the law by the EU. It's an environmental measure, but we all know in this room de facto it's a trade in defense instrument. And we have here today the new post safeguards, and I've already shown there. What we know so far is that we will have one regulation laying down the basic rules of the trade, new trade defense instrument, the new steel measure, but we will have plenty of implementing acts. And as you all know, the EU already, we will go into very much into detail, which will bring a lot of pressure on the EU importers because compliance is always a matter for the EU import side, which they then will inform their Turkish suppliers about and then request them to actually adhere to these principles. Let's start with where we come from, and I think you are all aware of that. We started with actual safeguards in 2018 on several steel products. We had even a WTO procedure on that safeguards initiated by Turkey, which ended with some success for Turkey when they challenged it, but in the end, nothing much was changed. Yeah, you are laughing. It actually, like it was, and it shows very much already that we are not talking about the EU leaving the WTO path now. We've always seen that WTO law is taken with some room for interpretation by the EU Commission and the EU in general. So this is where we come from, and now we are at the last point here, June 2026. Everything will expire. Why? Because at least in this regard, the EU Commission and or the EU legislator is adhering to WTO law. There's a WTO safeguards agreement, which the EU is party to, and that says very clear there is a time limit of the very maximum of 8 years to have safeguards in place. Ideally, the WTO measure is actually designed to have much shorter safeguards. They're more talking about 2 years, 3 years. 8 is already a stretch. And we've all seen in June 2024, some of you might have been affected, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the market again because we had a revision of the safeguard measure, and liberalization was lowered instead of increased, which would be a WTO requirement, actually. What we have, and that's very important, under this safeguard, we always had country-specific quotas. We have a quarterly administration, and for some time we had some carryover. We had some, we were able to use some quotas that were not used up when the country-specific quota was depleted. And we had, for some developing countries, we had an exemption. I think that's not too much of interest here for the Turkish audience. That was the current design. And now for you in the room who are exporting to the EU, I think the most important part is this one. Almost all the categories that affect trade with Turkey were absolutely used up. And now the big question is, how will the country-specific quota for Turkey be going forward with the new measures? Another thing that I think is discussed much too little, and that's on the second pillar here. We have actually EU-Turkey customs union. It's not a free trade agreement. The legal basis of this customs union is scattered all over. The legal concept is not even perfectly clear what exactly the customs union takes. But we don't have a free trade agreement. We actually always thought that we have more than a free trade agreement. We have this customs union. I will touch this point back when we look at the new instrument and why this is important. Let's discuss the new proposal a bit more in detail. What does it actually mean and how do we actually call it? That's the very first question. At the beginning, the discussion was always, should we call it post-safeguards? Because it's the measure that will take place the day after the safeguards. But now the problem is there's WTO decision regarding the American post-safeguards, where the WTO said, by the way, that's not a safeguard in the meaning of the WTO law because the US didn't call it a safeguard. So now all of a sudden, we have a problem because we can't name it a safeguard. We have to call it a new measure. The name alone shows everybody we are actually in the EU extending a safeguard, but we don't want to call it a safeguard. So when you look at this instrument, you see a lot of problems from international trade law perspective. The EU has to navigate around, and if you ask me, I think they are not doing very well in finding the right name and the right approach, but that's debatable. The general idea, as most of you know, we have a total quota of 18.3 million tons per year for all countries, including, remember I said under the safeguards, developing countries that imported less than 3% or were responsible for less than 3% of the imports, they were exempt from the EU safeguards. They are now fully in. So this quota, this 18.3 million tons, is not only applying to the countries already covered by safeguards. It's worldwide, global. That's at least the intention right now. That's a 47% minus from the actual current safeguard. And we are looking at the double as high ad valorem duty imposed on the importers. We also have, that is a new design we copied from the US. You all might know about the Section 232 tariffs where I think it was under Biden, it was introduced a melt and pour requirement to actually trace where was the liquid metal once poured. That's the requirement. That's important. The melt and pour is very important for everybody who buys slabs and uses them for re-rolling or other purposes. And now one interesting thing, the EU has put this number, 18.3 million, they derive it from the 2013 data on the EU market. The market was completely different at that time, but that's the basis. And another thing, compared to the current safeguard, this is a permanent instrument that's coming up. It has no expiry date. It will not automatically end. They have not included any proposal to automatically end it. So it is, in this regard, not for safeguarding for a period of time to give the EU steel producers time to adjust. This is a permanent measure, which is understandable. In this regard, I understand where the EU Commission is coming from. because the overcapacity in the world is also not time-bound. So that's the connection here. We have a permanent measure because there is a permanent problem. From the scope, there's one legal issue that's making this very complex. If you have a free trade agreement with the EU, with the European Union, you usually the free trade agreement blocks the EU from adding additional tariffs. That's the basic rule. Everybody understands. So what are we doing right now in comparison to before? The EU safeguards, they had usually, the EU had in free trade agreements a separate safeguards clause. In free trade agreements, usually countries agree on a separate safeguards clause where the partner to the free trade agreement can say, we want to abstain from this rules of the free trade agreement for the time being because we have one of our sectors under pressure. And then it's not a violation of this free trade agreement to do so. This is usually very much aligned with the WTO law on safeguards. But if we are going to establish this new measure, we will have the problem that if you put it on all countries in the world, also the EU's free trade partners will be covered under this instrument, but there is no legal basis for doing so, except where the EU has a safeguards clause in this free trade agreement. So they're actually arguing that this measure will then be covered under the free trade agreement safeguards that the EU has negotiated with their trade partners. Why does this matter to Turkey? We have the customs union, but it's not formalized in the form of a free trade agreement. And we don't have a Turkish EU safeguard mechanism. So this is something where we see that we are even detaching more or moving away a bit more from this customs union between EU and Turkey. Another thing, just a side note, carry over, it's still under discussion if it will be allowed, if the quota is not used up, to carry over to the next year. But if the Turkish exporters follow Alexander's recommendation, I think we won't have this problem because you have export licenses or take care of that with other means. Legal basis for the ones who want to look it up. The measure is covered, or at least that's now the opinion of the EU Commission, that this measure is covered under Article 28 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And there's a question mark because I've brought you one very I know that's not Article 28. I have a slide on that. I just wanted to point out with this quote from the agreements on safeguards that Article 7 actually says when a safeguard ended, for a period, as long as the safeguard has been in place, there cannot be another safeguard. So the big question on WTO will be, and it's already discussed in the WTO meetings, that whether this is a safeguard or not. And now we all, at least for us lawyers, it will be very interesting to see whether the WTO will go down the route they have gone in the US case, where they said, this is not a safeguard because it was not called a safeguard, or they will say this is so much a safeguard in its design that this rule applies and the EU is in violation of WTO law. And this is now showing that we are actually seeing a shift in the EU Commission where people say we really want to try to be WTO compliant. That's why we are arguing with Article 28. But then you talk to distinguished scholars in world trade law and they say, I don't see Article 28 applying here. So this will be quite a fight. But nevertheless, please don't get me wrong. We lawyers, we can do a lot, but we are not miracle workers. So this will most likely apply in 1st of July. So even though it might be in violation of WTO law, there are many aspects that I would say will be a challenge in front of the WTO. It will apply because EU law is also valid, even though it violates, it might violate EU law. This slide, we've touched most of that already. This is just for comparison. Let us have a brief look. What does actually this Article 28 mean? And that's very important for the ones of you who do policy work with your Turkish ministries, etc. Article 28 is usually a long shot. Article 28 says if any member of the WTO revokes any of its agreements, any of its most favored nation duties, etc., then it first has to initiate discussions with their trade partners in the WTO. So the European Commission asked the European Council already in, I don't know exactly when it was, I think November, they already asked them, please give us the mandate so that we can negotiate with our trade partners. This mandate has not been mandated yet. So there are background talks, as we hear, but there are no official talks. What we've heard is that official talks are about to start after Easter. So in April now will be the start of the first official talks about this new measure. Because ideally, what does Article 28 WTO say? As a first step, you talk. The EU says we want to withdraw the most favored nation treatment on this particular steel product. We want to raise additional duties there. And then the trade partners will usually say, yeah, but then the trade balance will be shifted. So what do you offer as a countermeasure? Which sector then will you lower your duties? Would, for example, the Turkish government say, okay, we accept this steel safeguards, but then please lower your duties for something else in other products? Difficult because we have a customs union, we have zero tariffs anyway. So will there be investment opportunities? Will there be foreign direct investment, outbound investment from the EU? What's the deal here? And if there is no deal, then of course, even under Article 28, and there the EU Commission is right, that would be WTO compliant, they would still be allowed to implement this measure. But what's the consequence? The consequence is if there has not been any agreement between the EU and their trading partners on this measure, then the trading partners of the EU under WTO law are free to implement countermeasures as they see fit. And politically speaking, the most vulnerable, or there is one pain point the EU Commission is always willing to protect, almost as much as the steel business, and that's the food and agricultural sector. So maybe some countries will use this as leverage. We are all very keen to see how this will end up, and this might actually bring further disruptions in the international trade for the EU, but probably not too much relevant for the steel sector. Next thing, this kind of negotiations will usually take very long. We have a legal gap. We need to have agreements. We need to write them down. Need to come to conclusions, and then the next problem is what's with the conflicts under the free trade agreements. So what you see here is there's a lot of homework still to do on the EU Commission's side to make this a WTO compliant measure, and I have my doubts if this will actually work. This is for the big picture, international law. Let's now touch on one aspect that all of you will have to deal with if this measure comes through as it is designed. and that's the melt and pour requirement. This is the original proposal. On the next slide, I have some amendments that are already proposed. And one thing I want to shed light on, because we hear in discussions, there's a lot of misconception on the melt and pour criterion. The melt and pour criterion will not be another part of the rules of origin. It will be independent of that. And the important point here is point 3. When you export to the EU and your counterpart imports, when it comes to the normal duties, rules of non-preferential origin apply. If you look into trade under free trade agreements, maybe, depending on the rules of free trade agreement, the preferential origin applies. Anti-dumping, sorry, there's a G missing, rules of non-preferential origin. So dumping, the good originates from China, then it's the anti-dumping regulation on the Chinese products apply. But if the Chinese, the steel slab from China is sent to Turkey, and then a re-roller here re-rolls something, then the new product, the coil that's coming to the EU, has, from the non-preferential origin rules, has Turkish origin. But it will keep, for the post safeguards, it will keep its melt and pour origin China, because that's where the hot metal ones was poured. So for the application of the post safeguards, it will not be treated as if it is a Turkish good, but for all other trade measures, for all other customs related measures, it will be a Turkish product. CBAM is not listed here because CBAM follows a completely different idea. If you use default values, maybe I should have included it. If you use default values as importer for this Turkish coil, it will be under the default values of Turkey, even though the original slabs came from China. If you use the actual CBAM data, then of course this slab has to have the data from China. And if you don't have the data available for this slab, at least, you might have the chance to use the Chinese default value and then add the Turkish emissions on top. That's another topic. So the traceability, and that's the message here, the traceability of the steel, of the information along the supply chain matters a lot, and that's what you need to provide your EU customers with when selling to the EU, in order to have this as transparent as possible and predictable as possible. Otherwise, on the administration part, so far it looks as if the new steel measure will be applied very similar to the current safeguards. One problem under melt and pour, I don't know if it is a problem in a very prevalent problem in practice, but sometimes you might have mixed goods in pipes, for example. You have different sources and then put it together. The question is which origin will it have from the melt and pour perspective? As you can already see, there is an amendment already by the EU Council proposed to the proposal of the EU. So we are in the procedure of all 3 institutions of the EU, Commission, Council, and Parliament, getting together to find a compromise. And one important part here is that at the moment, the second line, at the moment of importation, importers of product categories set out shall provide appropriate evidence. So this evidence, if you take it by the letter, will already need to be provided at import, and not that you just can declare it and have the papers if customs ask. You have to already add this proof on importation for the melt and pour requirement. That's also new because under the current safeguards that wasn't necessary. Otherwise, the administration of this quota, as I said, will be very similar to the current safeguards. It will be a quarterly administration. We will still have the mechanism that on the day where the quota is depleted, all importers who have made customs declarations on that day will get a share of the quota. At least that's what currently is the design. But there are some ideas already and some discussions to make this even more granular and say basically the order of the import declaration matters. If one launches an import declaration at 10:31, he gets the quota. The one who is launching import declaration at 10:32 gets no quota. That's the alternative proposal, but I think this strict first come first served will not apply. We also have currently, as many of you probably know, a problem in applicability or the application of these safeguards in Spain and Italy differs very much from let's say Germany and the Netherlands, because in Spain and Italy you can withdraw parts of your customs declaration if the quota applies. And the big question is, will this be addressed in the new safeguard measure? And my bet would be that this would be better for everybody if this would be now solved in the new legislation. Another problem that some of you might come across, even though I think in the field we are discussing today, currently Turkey is not subject to anti-dumping duties, if I see it correctly. That's why my example is from China. But if we ever have, because currently in the hot rolled field, there are anti-dumping investigations. Usually in the past it was when there was an anti-dumping regulation coming up in the EU, then you paid either the safeguards and only the safeguards if the anti-dumping duty was below the safeguards, or you paid the safeguards plus an additional top-up all to the way to the anti-dumping duty. So there was no addition of duties. So the 25% safeguard duty was collected anyways, and if the anti-dumping duty was 30%, then another 5% would be added. Big question, how will this be under the new steel measure? Nobody has included this question yet in the proposal. It's an issue. If they go the same path than they have done in the past, the EU would have to include this mechanism that I have lined out here in the example in every single anti-dumping regulation that is law right now in the EU. So that's a massive amount of work. They would have to change all of them. Or they are wise and put it directly in the new regulation. So this will be an issue. If it's not solved, we have a time gap, a legal gap, where there might be the risk of anti-dumping duties and post-safeguards applying to the same product and top up. So for people here in the room who trade also with goods from other origins, not just Turkey, be aware that there is currently a risk of double exposure. That's it. I hope it was an overview and didn't go too much into detail, and open for questions now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hillmann. Very interesting for me specifically. Do we have any questions?
I'm more confused.
That's bad.
To be honest. Number one, WTO has lost its existence from what I see. And but I think it would be more clear for the audience here. We're talking about Chinese slabs rolled over here. Now, let's say you buy the Chinese slabs, you bring it here, you roll it, you make a hot roll coil, then you supply it to an automotive parts supplier. He takes it, he makes components out of it, and he exports it to Europe. If we start from this example, I think it'll be more clear for us. What happens if China has anti-dumping, right? Let's leave CBAM out for a moment, okay? That confuses the issue a little bit. So how is that handled? Because it's melted poured actually in China. It's rolled here in Turkey, and it's sold to an automotive component producer here in Turkey who produced, let's say, make it simple, shock absorber,
Yeah.
and sold it to an automotive in Europe.
Yeah, jackpot. The shock absorber is not in the list of goods covered by the new measure.
But then I go back to what Alexander is worried about, because when you're looking at the derivatives, that means the shock absorber producers are in an unfair situation in Europe.
Yeah, I'm
So
looking
did I
to
understand
JJ already.
Okay.
Yeah. So the question is, do we have downstream extension in this new
No.
steel measure? We don't right now.
We don't. Okay.
We have, even though there are some tariff classifications right now that are discussed and brought in by the European Parliament to be added to the catalogue of CN codes that were not covered by the safeguards. Welding wire, for example, was usually not a safeguard issue, but now it will be covered, potentially covered under the new measure. But shock absorbers, not yet.
I just gave that as an example because you're forming it into a completely something different. So that means we have a message to the service centers here in Turkey: start producing shock absorbers and send it to Europe.
Yeah, and until
Please
the next
don't do that.
downstream extension issue comes. Yeah,
Okay,
true.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions?
Last one theoretical question. If a country is not going to agree with those measures, could they theoretically suspend the FTA?
Usually not in full. That depends on the individual FTA. There are non-compliance clauses in all FTAs. Usually the free trade agreements would allow them for after usually also a dispute resolution procedure, then would allow them to impose some countermeasures or retaliatory measures, but they need to be proportional. So you wouldn't usually see a full FTA paused for the time being. You would see countermeasures on a part where it hurts the EU. And this will be also the trade. The big question under everybody, or for everybody who is concerned with this WTO approach the EU has taken, is which sector are the trading partners of the EU pulling to put pressure on the EU on this one? And the same under the FTAs. And of course, if a country says, so this is now enough, we had too many measures coming up that are in violation of the free trade agreement. We have all seen in the past, free trade agreements can also be cancelled. But I don't see that risk so much because this market is so important for most nations in the world, at least. But yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Another question, sorry. You were talking about an evidence that we have to bring on the melted and poured, that this cast is coming from one particular mill. And usually we have as an evidence the mill test certificate, which is also showing the heat, which is then identifying the supplier, actually the cast of the steel mill. That means going with the liquid steel mill into the casting operation and supplying the slab pad. I was thinking about when you're saying that they actually were deleting this clause and saying that we should bring another evidence. I'm just not sure what kind of evidence we should bring.
No, I think the general idea would still be the mill test certificate. Like, this would still be the prime instrument for that, for adding proof. But the next thing is how is this actually enforced? How will they check? Like, that this is actually correct. It's the same question actually asked under CBAM, but there we have independent verifiers. For the tariff rate quota that's discussed now, we won't have any verifiers. But for us as customs lawyers, it's daily business. We always have to deal with fraudulent documentation, and the customs authorities usually know how to deal with that. So we will see that. But the mill test certificate is the prime.
I'm just thinking about European customs, and we have experience with European customs. So you're actually entering your goods in, let's say, in Antwerp, and then you have customs check, and they are saying, this is not Turkish, that's Chinese. And I'm saying, well, here's the mill test certificate. And they say, well, in the legislation, it's for us not sufficient. It's not actually representative, or this mill certificate is not sufficient. So that means it opens a door for the customs authorities to easily reject a mill test certificate if they think it's not fine.
Generally, yes. But what in practice will happen is that customs isn't that fast, except they have some hint from somewhere that somebody is using fabricated documents. But usually customs will accept this document, and then a few weeks later, sometimes even 2 years later, they come to you and say, so we would like to have this mill test certificate because we have seen so many mill test certificates. This steel mill is actually producing 20 million tons of steel. That doesn't make sense. So we want to look who of you actually had the right ones and who has fabricated ones. And then for the importers, so the Turkish people in the room can relax, because for the importers in the EU, that will be a mess. But that's something we already see in a lot of free trade agreements when it comes to cumulation of origin and so on. So there is some experience in customs with that. But I agree, it would be better to have at least one clear evidence in the legislation, but then also please don't limit it to this, because sometimes a mill test certificate for some reason might not be the right proof for this particular goods. Yeah.
Your first point cannot be applicable with the reduced quota, because with the reduced quota,
exactly,
you will never have actually an exhaustion of a production level. Let's put it this way.
Yeah. So with the quota, they will apply it. Then, for example, if the mill test certificate says I'm a Turkish product, it goes into at the day of customs clearance, it goes to the Turkish quota, using up the Turkish quota. And then 2 years later, customs finds out that was not a Turkish product. You came with Chinese products, and you didn't have any quota, so we want additional 50% customs. But the Turkish quota will be used up by this fraudulent product. So this kind of circumvention will be tackled on the administrative part.
I have a small question, if possible. Maybe I missed some details. Sorry about that, if it's true. Is there any understanding how the quota, the new one, will be distributed between the sources and origins, especially if we are including the ones who were below the 3%, for example?
Currently, there is no country-specific quota. There will be country-specific quotas. There are different versions to do that. Either you just take the currently existing quotas under the steel safeguards and apply them pro rata, or what we have heard from the team that might do the negotiations, but this is all unverified information. Also in the negotiations that will happen under Article 28, the discussion of quotas will be opened, especially for the countries with free trade agreements with the EU. And so we might see some shifts, pro rata shifts in the quota. And to be very clear, this is designed against Chinese overcapacity. So they probably are happy to give individual quotas, country-specific quotas, because this will all eat up and end up lowering the general quota for all countries.
Do we have any timeline when to expect?
No, basically no. Worst case would be that if I should take a bet, I would say we will have something on 1st of July. But they need to find a simple solution to have something on 1st of July, because otherwise we will have 18.3 million tons of unallocated quota for just one general 18.3 million tons quota. And you can imagine what happens with some exporting countries if this quota is available to them immediately, of course. So there need to be, and that's something for the Turkish producers, push as much as you can that there is a reasonable Turkish quota at the 1st of July.
Thank you so much
You're welcome.
for the presentation.